hospitals once a week.
Yeah.
All right, we're on. As far as I know, we're on. All right, I hope we are on live, and Dave, is Sarah on the way?
She's walking away.
Okay, good. And we've got Dave Rimmer with us today, so we really appreciate him coming. And Dave and I have been good friends for many years. We used to jog together, and David used to be a prosecuting attorney. Now he's a judge, and he used to have his own radio program and taught Bible classes. I remember a Bible class he had one time on speaking in tongues, and when he got through with his law background, he asked us any questions, and no question could have been asked because he covered the bases so well.
Yeah.
It was absolutely perfect. So this is Sarah. Hey,
Hi,
Sarah.
Sarah.
Sure glad you came. And of course, you know Dave.
Yes.
He's the one talking
Hi.
this stuff.
She's
All right.
she's the one going to law.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right, so David, it's all yours, and
All right.
take as long as you like.
All right.
Let me hit this other recorder. One more second. All right, it's all yours.
All right. Well, as Clint mentioned, I am a circuit judge, and I was a prosecuting attorney for 27 years before I became a judge. But I got saved when I was 17 years old, and I've been reading the King James Bible ever since. Came down here 49 years ago to go to Bible school, and graduated in 1970. And then the Lord just sort of led me down different paths until I wound up in law school. And so anyway, here I am, and I've got a message here that I preached about a year ago over in near Mobile, Alabama. And if you'll turn to 1 John 2:1, this is what my message is about. In 1 John 2:1, he says, "My little children, these things write I unto you, that ye sin not. And if any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous." The word advocate only appears here. It appears nowhere else in Scripture. And I'm sure you're familiar with the term, but the term advocate means somebody who defends or pleads for another. And it usually refers to lawyers, because as a lawyer, you represent somebody else and you plead their case in court. Typically, of course, lawyers, contrary to what a lot of people think, lawyers do some good because they are necessary for the administration of justice and the resolution of conflicts. Unfortunately, the legal profession has obtained a bad reputation because of some of the bad lawyers, and of course, they're known for taking a lot of money from people. But and the Bible has a negative view of them as well. In Luke chapter 7, verse 30, it says, "But the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the counsel of God against themselves, being not baptized of him," in reference to John the Baptist. Luke chapter 11, verse 46 says, "And he said, Woe unto you also, you lawyers, for ye laid men with burdens grievous to be borne, and ye yourselves touch not the burdens with one of your fingers." And then in Luke 11:52, he says, "Woe unto you lawyers, for ye have taken away the key of knowledge. Ye entered it not in yourselves, and them that are entering in ye hindered." There's really only one exception that I can find in the Bible about lawyers, and that's in Titus chapter 3, verse 13. Paul tells Titus, "Bring Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their journey diligently, that nothing be wanting unto them." So there might be just that one lawyer in the Bible that was a good lawyer. It was somebody that Paul was interested in and needed his services. And of course, when we read through the book of Acts, you see all the legal problems that Paul had, so it's not surprising that he needed a lawyer, although most of the time in the book of Acts, he's basically representing himself, as you'll notice. As a matter of fact, in Acts chapter 5, we have a lawyer named Gamaliel, a doctor of the law, who intervened on behalf of Peter and the apostles when the high priest and the council were determined to kill them. So they got the benefit of a lawyer there. in Acts chapter 5 that helped him out. And it refers to Gamaliel as a doctor of the law. And a law degree is called a doctor of jurisprudence or a juris doctorate in the law. Lawyers are also known as counselors of law. In fact, my law license that I got from the Florida Supreme Court says that I am an attorney and counselor at law. Now, the term counselor of law is interesting because, in 1 John we find out that the advocate is Jesus Christ. And in Isaiah 9:4 it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." So he's also referred to as counselor. So, and that's what a lawyer does. A lawyer counsels people in the law. And one of the fundamental rights that we have under the United States Constitution is the right to have a lawyer when somebody's facing criminal charges. The Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which was put in there in 1791, says that in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So that's why, and I know you've heard this expression before, they call it the Miranda warnings that came from a 1966 United States Supreme Court case that says that if somebody's in custody and they're being interrogated, that the police have to advise them of their rights, including the right to have an attorney. Well, under our American system of justice, anybody who's accused of a crime is presumed to be innocent. And there's two things a prosecutor has to prove in every case before somebody can be found guilty of a crime. There's two things. Number one, the prosecutor has to prove that the crime that this person is accused of was committed. And then they got to prove that this person is the one who committed the crime. Because, somebody reports a crime, first you got to prove that the crime was committed. Once you prove that the crime charged was committed, then you have to prove as a prosecutor that this person is the one who committed that crime. Those are the two things. And the accused in our system does not have to prove his innocence. He doesn't have to prove anything. It's all up to the government to prove each and every element of the crime beyond to the extension of to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. So the accused can just sit there, doesn't have to say a word, doesn't have to testify. The prosecution can't even argue to the jury that he did not get on the stand and deny the charges. Can't do that because that penalizes him for exercising his constitutional right to remain silent. So the system we have benefits certainly people who are accused of a crime, and it's up to the government to prove those things. Now, contrary to our system of justice, everybody's a sinner and everybody's already guilty. So people who are talking about getting saved, talking about becoming Christians, you have to presume they're lost until they show you otherwise. For example, John 3:18 says, "He that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already." So they're already guilty. See, under God's system, people are already guilty. Under the American judicial system, they're presumed innocent until they are proven guilty. So it's just the opposite with God. They're already guilty. Romans 3:19 says, "Now we know that whatsoever things the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God." James chapter 2, verse 10, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point is guilty of all." So we're guilty. All right? So then God looks at everybody, and you're guilty. 1 John 3:4 says, "Whosoever committeth sin transgresses also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law." In Ecclesiastes 7:20, he says, "For there is not a just man upon the earth that doeth good and sinneth not." So everybody's a sinner. Everybody is lost until they get saved. And here's the thing about an advocate. When somebody gets convicted of a crime, keep in mind, like I told you, when they go to court and they're accused of a crime, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. The prosecution has the burden or the duty to prove its case. If they can't prove its case, then the accused is not guilty. They walk out free. Now, if they get convicted, though, and they're found guilty and they're going to appeal their conviction, it's turned around. Because once they are found guilty and they appeal to a higher court, the higher court assumes they're guilty because they were found guilty. So now they have the burden to convince the appellate court that their guilty verdict should be overturned. And usually what happens in an appellate case, they have to show that there was some error in the trial that denied them their right to a fair trial. Something happened in the trial that wasn't fair. Either the judge gave the wrong jury instructions, made a mistake. The prosecutor said something, made an argument to the jury that was improper. In some cases, they can get a new trial because their lawyer was not a good advocate. In other words, they have to show that their lawyer was totally incompetent, and if it wasn't for that, they wouldn't have got convicted. So it's really difficult. It's very, very difficult to get a conviction reversed on appeal. The hard part for the prosecutor is get the conviction to start with. Once the prosecutor's done that, his job's over. Now the accused wants to try to get their conviction reversed. They got a hard road to hoe there. And I've learned in my experience that, of course, there are some lawyers who are better than others. And I think everybody knows that. Everybody wants, of course, to get the best lawyer they can find to represent them on whatever type of legal problem they got. And not all lawyers are the same. Some lawyers are alcoholics. I've known some. Some lawyers are addicted to drugs. I've known some of them. Some lawyers are just lazy. I know some of them. But some lawyers are very, very committed and very conscientious and do a good job. And hopefully you want to find a good lawyer. I heard a joke one time about a guy that said his lawyer was so good, he got a blind man a driver's license. Well, that's kind of probably really couldn't do that, but that's how good his lawyer was, supposedly. And I've heard lawyers that say they've never lost a case. You've probably seen them on TV. They say they've never lost a case. Well, whenever you hear a lawyer say they never lost a case, you know one thing right off the bat. That lawyer hadn't tried very many cases. Or that lawyer just picks and chooses the cases they want to try. When I was a prosecutor, I used to run into people like that. They didn't want to take the case to trial unless they knew they could win. I mean, they had to have overwhelming evidence. If they couldn't win, they were afraid to go into court. And I've known lawyers who were afraid to try a case against a particular defense attorney because they didn't want to lose to that defense attorney. I used to have a plaque on my wall in my office when I was a prosecutor. That's a quote from Babe Ruth, the famous baseball player. He said, "Never let the fear of striking out get in your way." And I always like that because, you go in there, you do the best you can. It's up to the jury. Who knows what they're going to do? But don't let the fear of striking out get in your way. And a good lawyer does not let the fear of striking out get in his way. Now, in our criminal justice system, it's the prosecutor who brings the criminal accusations against the accused. And he files what's called an information. That's a formal charging document. It's called an information. There's also, you've heard the term indictment. An indictment is something that's handed down by a grand jury. And in Florida, all criminal charges are filed by the prosecutor in this document called an information, except for one kind of charge, and that's first-degree murder. Because first-degree murder carries a possible death penalty, and therefore, under the United States Constitution, it has to be by grand jury indictment. So in Florida, if the prosecutor looks at a homicide case and says, I believe the evidence in this case is such that this is a first-degree murder case, so I've got to take it to a grand jury, let the grand jury decide whether or not they want to indict this person for a charge of first-degree murder. Now, sometimes they'll take other cases to the grand jury, maybe some high-profile political case or some allegation of misconduct by a government official. They can do that. They don't have to do that, but they can do that, and a lot of times they will do that. They'll just submit this particular problem to the grand jury and let the grand jury decide whether or not any charges ought to be filed. But they're not required to. They are required to on a first-degree murder case. Now, here's something real interesting. I notice every time I read through the book of Acts that I see certain things in there that are consistent with our form of criminal justice. For example, in Acts chapter 24, it says that after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him. And see, that's what the prosecutor does. The prosecutor brings the allegations, brings the accusations against somebody, and informs against them. Files this document called an information. And what's interesting, I got on my phone, my cell phone, I got an app called Touch Bible. I don't know if y'all ever have it or not, but it's the King James, and it's called Touch Bible. And you can open it up, and you can type in whatever book or whatever chapter and verse you want to look at. And also it would tell you what these names mean. What's interesting is, according to the Touch Bible, the name Tertullus means triple hardened, which I find interesting because he was a prosecutor basically against Paul, and his name is triple hardened. And also the term orator, he's described as an orator, a certain orator named Tertullus. Well, that term orator means lawyer. It means lawyer. So here he is. Tertullus is a hard-nosed prosecuting attorney bringing allegations against Paul, informing the government against Paul. Now, there's another lawyer who is also a very prosecutor, hard-nosed prosecutor. And this particular prosecutor, you will find him described in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9 to 10. It says, "And the great dragon was cast out, the old serpent called the devil." And down in verse 10 it says, "He is the accuser of our brethren, which accuse them before God day and night." He's an accuser. He's like a prosecutor. And there was another prosecutor, Moses. In John chapter 5, verse 45, it says, the Lord says, do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one that accuses you, even Moses, in whom you trust. So, the devil's a prosecutor, and he accuses everybody, and, he knows every sin everybody's ever committed, and he accuses of it. So, if you're going to go to court against the devil, think about this. If you're going to go to court against the devil, you're going to need a really good lawyer. All right? You're going to have a lawyer that really knows what he's doing and how to do it. Well, you know how out on the street you see these homeless people? I drive around, I see them on the street, they got these signs. The best one I ever saw, and I tried to get a picture of it, I think it was at the exit ramp on Interstate 110 at Brent Lane. There was this guy, and he was a homeless guy. He was real ragged looking. He looked really like he's, had nothing. He was all shaggy and everything. And he had a sign that said, "My wife had a better lawyer." And I thought, that's pretty good. That was a good sign. So, that's the way some of these people feel when they come out of divorce court. They probably feel like, "Oh, yeah, she had a better lawyer." Well, there's an old saying that he who represents himself has a fool for a client. In my experience down through the years, I've seen a lot of people try to represent themselves in court. That's a bad idea. Let me tell you, that is not a good idea. Because for one thing, a person goes into court and they got these ideas in their head about how they're going to present their case, and they don't understand the rules of evidence. And they'll start trying to introduce evidence, and the prosecutor's going to object to it because they're not doing it the right way. And they're held to the same standard as a regular lawyer. So if they want to represent themselves, that's fine. They have a right to do that. See, that's the thing. A person charged with a crime, if they so desire, they can represent themselves. They don't have to have a lawyer. They have a right to have a lawyer. And if they cannot afford a lawyer, the state will give them a lawyer. Okay? But there's some people that have this bad impression of public defenders that they think public defenders are not real lawyers. In fact, I've heard them say, "Did you have a lawyer or did you have a public defender?" They're actually the same. And they're very good. Most of the ones I ever dealt with were very, very good, very competent, because that's all they do is criminal cases. They do criminal cases all the time. They know the criminal law. They know the criminal rules of evidence. They know how to present a case to a jury. They know how to pick a jury. And I have, since I've been a judge, I've sat on cases in which somebody's trying to represent themselves, and they do a terrible job. They just do a terrible job. I had a case several years ago, and these two guys were charged with an elaborate scheme. They were inmates in the state prison system, and they had this elaborate scheme whereby they were stealing Social Security numbers, and somebody on the outside was then filing for IRS tax refunds. They were actually getting a lot of money. Anyway, they got caught doing that. So they're charged with some various crimes, and they're up there, and they're trying to pick their own jury, trying to represent themselves, and it was terrible. That's their right if they want to do it. There were a couple times when I would call the guy to the bench, and I would say, "Are you sure you want to do this way?" And I would explain to him the disadvantages, and he'd go, "Oh yeah, I didn't think about that." I can't try his case for him. I can't protect him. But every now and then I would just sort of say, "Look, this is not a good idea." And I would tell them, I said, "Look, you can have a lawyer. I will appoint a lawyer for you." And he would say, "No, I don't want to represent myself." Okay, fine. So he represents himself, and he winds up getting convicted. And I think they gave him like 22 years state prison because he had a bad criminal record. So, that's too bad, he shouldn't try to represent himself. So if somebody's going to go up against the devil, they better have a good lawyer. And we have the advocate, Jesus Christ the righteous. Here's something to think about. The devil can beat any lawyer except for one lawyer. He can't beat Jesus Christ the righteous. That's the only lawyer he's never been able to beat. Now think about this. The Lord Jesus Christ, as our advocate and as a lawyer, he never charges a fee for his services. Think about that. Think about what the very best lawyer that money can buy would cost. Lawyers charge a lot of fees. You know, I'm doing mostly just divorce cases and stuff, and I see these divorce lawyers come in there, and it's not unusual to have the attorney's fees being over $100,000. I mean, $100,000 in attorney fees. And they do a lot of work, but that's, you know, some of them charge $275 an hour, some of them charge $300 an hour. That's a lot of money to hire a lawyer. And a lot of people, of course, don't have the money, so therefore they can't hire a lawyer. Well, the advocate that we have never charges a fee. I heard a joke one time about a guy that went to a lawyer, and the lawyer says, for $500, you can ask me 2 questions. And the guy said, $500? Isn't that kind of expensive? The lawyer said, no, not really. Now, what's your second question? They're known for charging a lot of money. I'm telling you, that's for sure. But that isn't all. He never turns down a case. No matter how much overwhelming evidence there may be, the advocate we have never turns anybody away. He never lets the fear of striking out get in his way because he never strikes out. So he doesn't charge a fee. He never turns down a case. And he only represents those who are actually guilty. That's what's interesting. You know, in Romans chapter 5, verse 8 says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And I used to tell people, I said, look, he died for sinners. Are you a sinner? If you're not a sinner, then he didn't die for you. Are you a sinner or not? If you are, he died for you. So all his clients are guilty. And I've noticed going through the Old Testament, there's a lot of places there that talk about God pleading our case. For example, Micah chapter 7, verse 9 says, I will bear the indignation of the Lord because I have sinned against him until he plead my cause. In Psalm 35:1, he says, plead my cause, O Lord. Psalm 43:1, judge me, O God, and plead my cause against an ungodly nation. And in Proverbs 22, he says, rob not the poor because he is poor, neither oppress the afflicted in the gate, for the Lord will plead their cause. Proverbs 23, he says, remove not the old landmark, and enter not into the fields of the fatherless, for their Redeemer is mighty, he shall plead their cause. So we have a lawyer who will plead our cause. And under the rules regulating the Florida bar, the rules that lawyers are required to follow in Florida, a lawyer is required to provide competent representation and understand the law. In other words, he's supposed to know the law. All lawyers are supposed to know the law. You assume the lawyer knows the law. Well, you know, I've dealt with some attorneys over the years. Some of them know the law and some of them don't. And they'll file motions that are not really properly filed, but that's very rare. Most lawyers do know the law. That's what they do. They're supposed to know the law. And did you know that in Florida, there are over 1,000 chapters in the statute books on all kinds of law? Well, no lawyer can know all that by heart. I mean, you know, we have to look it up. You know, luckily we got computers now, and I can really find stuff really, really quick. And but typically in those days, you had all these books, and we still have the books, but we hardly ever use them because, like I said, everything's on the computer now. But in a law library, I know you've seen all those books, you know. Well, those are books of cases, and typically what you do as a lawyer, the legal authority that you rely upon is the written law, the statute, and then cases that have been interpreted the law. So you'll pull these cases off the shelf, and you'll present the case to the judge, and if that particular case supports your argument, then you want the judge to follow that case. So that's how you do it. And if your interpretation of the statute is supported by a particular case, then you argue that to the judge. You say, this is how this case interpreted the statute. But the lawyer that we have, he knows all the law, all of it by heart, because for one thing, he wrote it. So think about that. he wrote the whole thing, so he knows every word in the law. And, you know, in Florida, there isn't any lawyer around, I guarantee you, that knows all the law in over 1,000 chapters in the statute books. So he knows the law, and he's the best lawyer you can possibly get. Typically, like I said earlier, when somebody's going to appeal their conviction, they have to show that there was a mistake made in the trial below. And, you know, usually what happens is, usually it's the judge. The judge either allowed certain evidence to go to the jury, which was improper, and which, you know, influenced their verdict, or he withheld certain evidence. He wouldn't let the defense present certain evidence for whatever reason. And so, you know, he might get reversed because they might say, well, that was error. And if it had not been for that error, the outcome of the trial may have been different. So we're going to order a new trial. You know, that's what happens. Sometimes a prosecutor will make a mistake by either making an argument to the jury that's improper. And there's a lot of things. And I'm telling you, that's why, you know, you don't ever want to represent yourself, because there's just so many pitfalls. Even trained attorneys stumble. Trained judges stumble. You know, and somebody walks in and go, oh, no, I think I know this better than my lawyer, so I'm going to represent myself. Big mistake. Anyway, not only does he never charge a fee, like I said before, he never loses. He has a perfect record. Now think about this. The judge is his father. Now in our legal system, you could never have that. In our legal system, if for example, if one of my sons was an attorney, and they're not, but if one of my sons was an attorney and they had a case and they came before me, I would have to remove myself from the case. See, because, you know, it would be improper for the judge to decide the case when one of the lawyers is his own son. That's because, you know, obviously it gives the impression that the judge is biased, you know, because this is his son here. Well, and another reason why Jesus Christ, the advocate, is the best lawyer is the judge is his father. And there's nothing anybody can do about that. So, I mean, think about it. Think about the fact that you can have a lawyer like that. What if, just think about it, what if under our system there was no restriction against a judge sitting on a case in which his son was one of the attorneys? Suppose that was legal. Well, what do you think the chances are that his son would win? Great chances, right? I mean, not only is he a lawyer who's never lost a case, he's never lost a case in front of his father. See? So when we have Jesus Christ the righteous, we have the best lawyer that anybody could ever have. Basically, somebody's facing charges and they need somebody to bail them out. Back in, a long time ago, over 30 years ago, I was in court conducting what's called arraignments. And arraignments are when somebody's charged with a crime, they come to court the very first time, and they are arraigned, or they are informed of the charges. They are asked, how do you plead? They are asked if they want a lawyer, do they want a jury trial? And typically what happens at arraignments, they'll come in, and if it's a misdemeanor, they'll plead guilty maybe, and they'll, ask the judge for a break of some kind. If it's felony, they don't hardly ever plead guilty to felonies, right then and there, because their lawyer has to get an opportunity to kind of look over the case. But they can do that in misdemeanor cases. And I was in court, and this lady was charged with drunk driving. She had been involved in a traffic accident. She ran into the rear of another vehicle that was stopped at a red light. And she was under the influence of alcohol, so she was charged with that. And in the accident, she broke her arm. So when her case was called, she came forward, and she did not have a lawyer. And the judge asked her, did she plan to get a lawyer? Did she want a lawyer? And she said no. She didn't want to hire a lawyer, and she wasn't going to contest it. She just wanted to go ahead and plead guilty because she knew she was guilty. And so the judge had to make sure that she understood what rights she was giving up, by entering a plea and all that. So the judge went through all that with her, and he took her plea. She pled guilty. And then the judge imposed a mandatory fine. There are certain mandatory fines in drunk driving cases and in other cases as well. So the judge had to impose the fine. And the lady just kind of hung her head down. I'll never forget this. She hung her head down, and she says, I can't pay the fine, Judge. I don't have it. I just can't pay the fine. And at that moment, this man stood up in the back of the courtroom, raised his hand, and said, I'll pay her fine. And the judge says, well, lady, looks like you got a friend. And this guy came forward. I don't know if he was a stranger or a friend of hers or whatever. But he stood up, raised his hand, said, I'll pay her fine. And he paid her fine. And that's what the Lord Jesus Christ did. He paid our fine. He stood up and raised 2 arms and said, I'll pay his fine. He did that. He's a friend that sticketh closer than a brother, who also happens to be a very, very good lawyer. And, one time there was a judge in our town. He's retired now. But this story has been told many, many times. In the Korean War, he was in the military, and he was captured. He and several other soldiers were captured. And one day they were all taken to a hilltop, and they were going to be executed by these Korean soldiers. And just before they were executed, the commander showed up and stopped it. And he got out and, later on went to law school, became a lawyer, and became a judge. And that's an amazing story when you think about it. There's a legal document called a Writ of Habeas Corpus. And that is used by somebody who's a prisoner who is challenging the legality of their arrest. It's usually filed by somebody who's on death row, claiming that the sentence is unconstitutional, and they're asking the court to release them. That's what habeas corpus means the body of the person. And they're challenging the legality of their sentence. Now you think about this. There was a time when each of us were on death row. We were about to be executed, and this advocate came forward with a writ of habeas corpus in his hand, and he said, you got to turn him loose. You can't hold that person anymore. And so we got the best advocate that anybody could ever have. We have Jesus Christ, the righteous. And when he got us out, all the evidence disappeared. Now think about that. In a criminal case, if the police arrest somebody, like say on a drug charge, and it's determined that the search was illegal, then those drugs are thrown out. So the evidence is gone now. So now the prosecution has no case because they have no evidence. And if the only evidence they had was the drugs, and the drugs have been suppressed because they were seized illegally by the police, out goes the case. Did you have a question?
Isn't that the fruit of the poisonous tree?
Well, it's connected to that. In other words, if they obtain something illegally, and as a result of that, they get some other stuff, the fruit of the poisonous tree, the whole thing's poison. Yeah, it's related to that, exactly. But I prosecuted a murder case one time, and this guy got shot. What happened? These 2 guys were drunk, and one of them shot the other one. And the police arrived. He kept saying, "Oh, ain't nothing. It's just a flesh wound. Ain't nothing. He's okay. It's just a flesh wound." Well, he killed the guy. The guy was dead. So anyway, we go to trial, and just before the trial, I went to check all the evidence and see what evidence, the police had collected. They collected a lot of evidence. And, of course, I wanted to see the murder weapon, the gun. It's kind of important, you know what I mean? Get over there to the sheriff's office, and they couldn't find it. I'm going, what do you mean you can't find it? It's the murder weapon. It's the gun. They searched and searched. I never could find it. So, I had enough evidence to go to trial. I didn't need the murder weapon because of all the other evidence I had. I mean, the guy admitted he shot the guy. And the pathologist was going to testify, yeah, he died as a result of a gunshot wound. So, there was evidence of that. So I went to trial, and I thought, well, I hope the defense doesn't pick up on the idea that, I've never introduced the gun. I thought, I'm just going to go ahead and try the case. I'm not going to say anything. And, I presented the case, and at no time did the defense attorney say, oh, by the way, officer, well, what did you do with the gun? Nobody said nothing about it. And so, I presented my case, jury found him guilty. But, it could have been really bad if the whole case hinged on the evidence that no longer existed. And you think about that. Our advocate was able to get all the evidence thrown out. Any confessions we made can't be used against us. We have an advocate that never lost a case. He's the only advocate that can beat the devil, who is the prosecutor who accuses everybody. And so now, if they were going to try to bring a case against you, they would have to go to the evidence room to see what evidence is there, and they'd find it's empty. They would look at the trial record, and there's always a record maintained of these jury trials. You've seen court reporters, and that's what court reporters do. They take down everything that everybody is saying, and then there's a written record of the trial later on. And that's what the appellate courts rely upon. The appellate courts look at the written record of the trial to determine, what happened, and whether or not, they want to affirm the judgment of the lower court or they want to reverse it. But anyway, in this case, you look at the record and every page is blank. There's no evidence. So if there's no evidence, and there's no witnesses, and there's no record, there's no case. So we got an advocate that can do all that, and in that situation, it's over. Okay? So we have the advocate, and that word advocate, it only appears one time in the Bible, and that's in 1 John 2. We have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. An advocate with the Father. Think about that. So why anybody would think they can defend themselves out into eternity without that advocate, that's a big mistake. That's like somebody trying to represent themselves in court without the benefit of an attorney. And the nice thing about it is you don't have to have any money because he'll take your case for free. And he's competent because he's never lost a case. And he's fearless because he never lets the fear of striking out get in his way. So you can't beat that. So that's the advocate that I have, and I'm assuming you do too. Thank you very much.
Excellent. All right.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
That's excellent.
Very good.
Thanks.
Sarah's got me a lot of questions.
That's all.
What are you majoring in?
Legal studies.